Welcome to the Social Mobility Talks podcast, brought to you by the Social Mobility Commission. The SMC publishes research on social mobility, and we use this to provide advice to the government. We also work to support and promote social mobility ourselves by collaborating with and challenging employers, professionals, universities, schools, families, and other organisations to each play their part and to make social mobility a reality. Today's episode is hosted by me, Resham Kotecha, Deputy Chair of the Social Mobility Commission, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce and welcome Adrian Joseph to the podcast. So Adrian, thank you so much for joining us. I'll now hand over to you, and if you could introduce yourself, your sector experience, and why you care about social mobility, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Resham, for inviting me. And I've been in the what I call the applied AI space now for over a decade. I started my career in tech at Google. I was there for over 10 years. I then moved to EY and was a partner leading data and AI. And then I was, until recently, the chief data and AI officer for a big FTSE 100 company. In my spare time, I've been a member of the AI Council, helping to advise the UK government on the national AI strategy, including the risks associated with AI. And I've been involved in a number of charitable organisations. So I was chair of the Race Equality Board for nearly 5 years, and I was a trustee on the Alito Foundation. That is a charity that I care a lot about because it helps young people from non-privileged backgrounds to have the sort of access that my kids take for granted. So pretty passionate about a number of things, but 3Ds that really matter to me: data and AI, digital transformation, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think those three things are connected in the context of what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Adrian. And of course, you are far too modest to mention that you were actually awarded an OBE for your services to equality and diversity. So we couldn't have a better expert to talk about AI, technology, and social mobility here with us. So thank you very much for your time today. So it'd be great just to start if you could give us a little bit of insight into how AI is being used to tackle inequalities and where you see that potential.
Yeah, so maybe just a couple of comments on AI. It's probably the most disruptive technology trend that we're going to see for the next 5 years. And we've seen major advances in the last 18 months, in the last 12 months, in the last 12 weeks, in the last 12 days almost. The speed with which it is changing is pretty phenomenal. So keeping abreast of all of what's happening in the world of AI is a tremendous challenge. But in the context of social mobility, I make some generic points. We can use AI and sometimes generative AI techniques to interrogate data sets that allow us to look at anomalies, discrepancies, to identify bias, discrimination, to identify misinformation, hallucination, and also to summarize some of these findings. So we can use techniques like large language models that allow us to synthesize very large data sets and extract much more condensed views that are summarized for individual users. So our ability to look at data sets, to interrogate them, has never been more profound than it is right now. So in a generic way, AI can help to interrogate Ministry of Defense data, Ministry of Health data, for example, or look at criminal justice systems, or look at other ways in which bias and discrimination might occur.
And you've just referenced AI and generative AI. And for any of our audience members who might not be aware of the differences, could you just explain, kind of in layman's terms, what that means and give an example of the application just so that people can follow the conversation as we
Yes,
progress?
sure, happy to do that. So AI generically, when I think about AI, I think about, I like the UK government sort of definition, which is autonomous and also adaptive. So AI is doing things in many cases better than we are. It is outperforming us in many areas of detecting cancer, in some cases, of translation, transcription. Of course, we've seen all this stuff about games. So generic term around autonomous and adaptive, that's important. Generative AI is, we've seen advances in the last sort of 18 months, maybe most publicly aware. People will be most publicly aware of things like ChatGPT, but also Bard from Google, and other large language models, as they're called in generative AI. And so what they do is essentially to generate new data that didn't exist before. So I think that's one of the main distinctions, that it's creating synthetic data, new things that didn't necessarily exist before. And with that comes a lot of risks that we can talk about as well in due course.
Well, I would love to talk about the risks, but let's first stay positive and talk about what are the positive implications of generative AI in helping us to think about social mobility and how we could advance that for the less advantaged people in society.
Yeah, so to give some examples, maybe more broadly of AI. So we can use AI to detect things like inequality. We can look at it to tackle diseases that are perhaps more relevant and more found in particular ethnic groups. So, for example, sickle cell or diabetes. So, that's one good example. We can look at it to identify and to address disparities in the criminal justice system, for example, and in the education system and in other areas of society. So, we're seeing new types of models that are able to detect bias, to detect toxic speech, to detect misinformation, to detect discrimination. Those are some examples. I think about the 2 million kids that are on free school meals. 2 million kids in the UK at the moment who are on free school meals. And some of the research from the EY Foundation shows that those young people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than their more privileged peers. Mm-hmm. Even when they've got the same qualifications as their more privileged peers, they're paid 50% less. And so being able to access that data, being able to interrogate that data, to look at where those disparities are happening is much, AI really enables us to do that much more rapidly and precisely than maybe we could before. And another area I think about is health equity. So using new technologies to improve the fairness and inclusivity of healthcare services, for example, is another area where there's a lot of opportunity for us.
And I found that really interesting, that point you made about being able to analyze the data and spot trends and pick out where we might not spot things. So when it comes to that, we obviously need people to be able to design what we're looking for. So how can people creating these models or applying them, these technologies, do so in a way that means that we can identify trends or that we can spot disparities?
Yeah, so I've believed for some time now. My experience shows that you need to have a number of skills come together to enable us to do the things that you've described. And so you need to have people who have the deep technical expertise in AI and so on, but you need to have people who also have the deep domain expertise in healthcare, in social justice, in education, working alongside the more technical teams and fixating on a problem that really matters. And so if those 3 things happen, you're really clear about the problem space or the opportunity space. You've got the domain expertise from the educators, the health teams, or policing, for example, and you've got the technical people, then that's where it works best in my experience.
And you've touched on the sector experience or the expertise there, the technical expertise, but I'd like to bring in kind of the third column that we haven't touched on yet, the policy and the government, because I imagine you're relatively unique in the position you have, in that you've had extensive and deep AI expertise. You've got deep experience with the Race Equality Board in terms of sectoral issues, and you've advised government in multiple roles, including your NED role. So how do you see that triangle working, and how can we ensure that government and policymakers have the information, the data literacy, the understanding of the sectoral issues and the inequalities to be able to create the policies that will tackle social mobility whilst using the technology?
Yeah, so you're right. It is the number of players that need to come into the frame to enable us to do these things. And so from a social policy perspective, I think it's really important for us to have frameworks to, one, understand the risks but also the opportunities. And when I think about the risks, I quite often think actually a lot of those risks we can turn into opportunities. So just to give you an example of, one of the areas of social mobility that came to my attention recently, was published by the BBC in December, and there was some research by the Bridge Group that showed if you were a white man from a higher socio-economic background, you're 30 times more likely to succeed in financial services than someone from a working class ethnic minority woman would be. Wow. That's what their study showed, and it was across 150,000 people. And so this is leading, potentially to the FCA maybe to consider forcing the collection and reporting of diversity and inclusion data under potential regulations. And so this is one of the examples of how exposing the data, finding the insights that were just revealed, and then hopefully taking action that will prevent that from being as severe as it currently is. And so if I think about those people who may be disadvantaged, that disadvantage in turn leads to lower performance, then I become more hopeful about the ability for AI, if it's used in the right way, to enable us to overcome some of these social disparities.
So actually, Social Mobility Commission research showed that the least disadvantaged children start school 5 months behind their most advantaged peers, and by the time they leave school, that gap has widened to 18 months. So I too am really excited by the potential of generative AI to help close the gap. So obviously there's a huge opportunity for the application of generative AI in schools, but you referenced it being used in the right way. So what do you mean by that? What's the right way to use it, and what are the risks of generative AI in education, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, the education is a interesting space for us to think about, because it is pretty fundamental to AI and how it develops. And I'll give you some examples. A number of universities, Oxford and Cambridge, for example, have shown that there's a strong correlation between the public being educated about AI and its acceptance. Mm-hmm. And we have pretty high levels of acceptance in the UK around AI, but it's something that we need to continue to think about. I think about education as well in a broader context. So I think teachers, students, and parents all have a role to play. And some ethnic groups that I have worked with over the years, the parents, for example, will say to their kids, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. They don't talk about technology or AI or any of those disciplines. And so, I think our parents also need to be educated to think about ways in which they can upskill and become more familiar and comfortable with their children having careers in a space where jobs are going to be, the world of work is going to be significantly transformed by AI and technology capabilities. So education is a space that I think about a lot. But you can also then think about having tailored education plans for individuals. So some of those people that you referred to who are 5 months behind, we can use AI techniques to help develop specific AI learning development plans for them that I've seen some evidence can close the gap between, their starting point and that 5 months gap that you referred to.
Well, great and very exciting. And I have to say, with my day job hat on, so I'm Global Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute. We love talking about data literacy and educating people of all ages. So that's really great that you support that. But on the education question, when we talk about generative AI, you mentioned the workplace changing, but the workplace is also going to change within education. So there is a potential conflict between teachers or those who will have to utilize these tools and the supporters of the tools, and the concern that jobs might be replaced. There's also a concern I've heard about we don't know what's happening in the algorithm. We don't know what data is being fed to the algorithm. So how can we be confident that our children are not being inadvertently taught things that are biased, racist, sexist, or if not quite so concerning, that they're not being taught things that are just wrong or inaccurate? So how do we counter for that risk?
So, I mean, I think about bias a lot, and there are three levels of bias that I think about. So there's bias in the data, there's bias in the algorithms potentially, and so we need to check for drift and hallucination and a host of other things. And then there's bias, in my view, in some of the people that are writing these algorithms. And so, my contention is that we would have a lot less gender biased, ethnically biased algorithms coming out from some of the large technology companies, for example, if we had much better representation in their workforces. So, I think in the numbers of the UK, about 1 in 10 data scientists are female. About maybe 5% of technology leaders in the UK are female, but there are 26% of women working in technology. Wow. So these are some of the things that, by actually getting access to the data, by interrogating it in the right sorts of ways, will help us to circumvent some of the risks. But there are many, many risks. I mean, it's a dual purpose technology, so it can do immense good, but it can also do immense harm. It's some people describe it as a stochastic parrot. It just regurgitates the bias that exists already in systems or in data. And I think that's something that's worth thinking about. We've seen a lot of AI algorithms that are biased towards particular ethnic groups or to women, for example. We've seen surveillance, we've seen classification errors that are brought to life by people like Joy Boulami, who describes herself as a poet of code. And she has shown that misclassification is much more likely in dark-skinned women, for example, who are more likely to be incorrectly classified with an error rate of about 35% compared to white men that is 0.8%. So some algorithms, have for example, classified Michelle Obama and Serena Williams as male. So these are examples of the risk, but the world of work will be very different in my view, and we can talk a bit about that if that's an area that you want to explore as well.
Definitely, and I'll just pick up on what you said. You've just referenced some statistics on the people working in it, and actually the Fawcett Society did a really interesting piece of research on this about tech bro culture, and that even though it's a highly lucrative field, a highly influential field, like women are still not entering it, partly because of this kind of slightly toxic masculine culture, which in itself means that we don't have the diversity you've referenced to actually review the algorithms, review the outcomes of these models, so they're not being caught in the way they would with diversity. But I do want to touch on the bias in data and what you think the implications are for social mobility itself. Like, why is biased data a concern when we think about those with less privilege or those who are not in the room to have their say?
Yeah, so having data sets that are representative of society and not just portions of it, and so we do have techniques where we can look at data and interrogate it and expose biases. I also think, by the way, that AI helps to expose bias in existing systems perhaps more rapidly, and sometimes AI gets branded as being the discriminator when actually what it's doing is detecting existing biases that have persisted for years and years and years, possibly for centuries, that weren't as obvious to us as we are seeing now. So those are the things that I think about in the context of bias. But we do need to be really careful. We also need to have models that have explainability built into them, so we understand why some of the decisions are being made, that we can track those back. So that's important too. And then there's a side of data around sort of privacy and consent, and people are using your personal data, my personal data. Many of the big technology companies have access to it, and the whole idea of sort of surveillance capital and being able to exploit the value in our personal data sets is an important thing for us all to think about, and to make sure that the data that we're providing, we're happy for it to be used in the way in which it's intended to be used, that it's sensitively managed, that it's privacy centric if we want it to be, that it's consent based, that we can revoke that consent if we want to. We know where it's stored. So the whole area of data and how it's created, curated, accessed, and exploited in some cases is a really important area for us to continue to fixate about.
And that point about privacy, consent, being able to withdraw it, trusting it's being used for the purposes you're sharing it for, I think is hugely important, because in order to consider social mobility, we're talking about a lot of protected characteristics here. We're talking about highly personal, highly sensitive information. And as you've referenced earlier, the technology gives us this huge ability to assess vast swathes of data and to be able to draw conclusions from that. But we have to have people's consent and trust that if they share their data, it will be used appropriately and will not be leaked or sold on. So what do you think we can do as a country, as a government, as a sector to make sure that we can encourage people to trust that that sensitive data that will hopefully help us further social mobility is safe?
Yeah, so I think some of the things around, being clear on how your data is being used, how it's being stored, how it's being accessed, who's using it, for what purpose, for what period of time. Those are all important considerations. But I would hope for us not, because we do have techniques that allow us to overcome some of these things. So I can use systems like masking or tokenization or encryption techniques that will allow me to use your private sensitive data in a way that doesn't expose you as an individual. So there are a number of techniques that allow us to overcome those very valid concerns that the public may have about how their data is being used. But I would still urge caution in being clear about upfront knowing these things around consent and storage and how it's being used and for what purpose and by whom.
And then let's talk for a second about redress. So where personal data or sensitive data is misused, mishandled, not kept safe, where that it does impact someone. And we've seen cases where people have been rejected from jobs, people have had parole overturned because of biased systems that grant parole more to white people than they do to people of colour. We've seen systems where HR systems reject women at a far higher rate than men because they've learned that men make better C-suite executives because that's the CVs and the data they've been shown. So how can we manage for a technology, as you say, that reflects or mirrors and amplifies the biases that already exist? But what can we do when that happens? How can we make people feel more confident that there is a way to appeal it, to challenge that bias that impacts lives?
So I think some of the things that that we identified when I was a member of the AI council, as I mentioned earlier, and we were heavily involved in helping the government to design the AI strategy for the UK, including the whole area of what we call responsible AI, or RAI for short, as it's now termed, right? And so we do have a national RAI team that are looking at this whole area. We have institutes like the Ada Lovelace Institute that are very, very focused on ensuring that we manage AI technologies in the right sorts of ways. A lot of the universities are doing great work as well in AI ethics, for example, at Oxford University, or responsible AI at Southampton and so on. So there's a lot of, and of course you've got the Centre for Data Ethics as well. So I think there's a lot of focus on this, and not just the sort of ethical use, but also the fair use and fair reward. And so how do we also ensure that not just big tech get the value from this, but SMEs, startups, that the sort of golden triangle, as it's called, of Cambridge, Oxford and London, which tend to be heavily AI centric, that we also broaden out and look at the great work that's been done in Edinburgh or in Bristol or in Birmingham or in Warwick, for example. And so a core part of what we tried to build into the national AI strategy was to ensure that there were more our ability to detect these things, but also to inherently embed these capabilities early on in terms of fairness and avoiding bias and discrimination and misinformation, to architect it early on into the systems. And so as a community, as a country, we should be asking hard questions of our technologists around, what are they doing to embed explainability? What are they doing to ensure that the results are fair? How do they know that that's the case? And so trying to catch these things before they actually happen, and then, through a range of institutes that I mentioned, we may be able to find redress. And of course, we got GDPR and a number of other regulations that help us to do that. But we may need more. One of the pieces of research that I referenced about in financial services, one of the recommendations is possibly from the FCA, is that we within financial services need to look at the data much harder than we ever did before, and take actions and have policies designed to overcome those issues that I mentioned.
And so one of the things you just referenced in your answer, you talked about the Golden Triangle, and you've talked about some of these kind of top-tier universities. One of the challenges in social mobility is the regional element, the regional inequalities, the fact that a lot of the larger companies are based in London or in the southeast. We see less opportunity, more challenge in terms of, high growth, well-paid jobs outside of cities. So we either end up with the need for a brain drain for people to really achieve their potential, or people in different regions not being able to fulfill their potential. So what can we do to make sure that these are not restricted to certain parts of the country, that we get the benefits of AI across the UK?
So I think one is being aware about it and, attuned to it. And yes, we have seen, for example, one of the areas that we looked at, and the AI Council recommended quite strongly, you referenced the session that I attended earlier in the House of Lords, where this came up as well. And so the whole idea of access to compute, to storage, to expertise is a real risk that you've alluded to in terms of some of the bigger technology companies who have the data, who have the compute power, who have the expertise, who've been hiring for many, many years, and also have large platforms. And so, ensuring that we have an ecosystem that can thrive wherever it is in the country, that gets the investment. And by the way, on the investment note, just one side point, which I think is very important actually, is that something like 80% of the VC funding in the last 10 years has gone to all male founders, startups. Only 3% has gone to all female startup founders. And so, these are some of the things that we need to be aware of. But we do have a wealth of expertise across the UK in R&D in the universities that we have. And I mentioned some of the universities up and down the country already. But it's something we need to continue to fixate on. We do need to make sure that it's not just big tech, but the startups get the opportunity to thrive. They also get the covered, that they're not just snapped up. Yes. And our UK AI startups, are incubating expertise, and then it's being acquired, potentially elsewhere. But the final point I would make that we recommended in that session at the House of Lords was around the UK having its own supercomputer capability. And so the government has now commissioned Bristol University to build an exascale computer, which will help with giving our universities the sort of access that many of the big technology companies take for granted.
And so you referenced the challenge for startups and for founders, and potentially there's a really exciting application of AI there to review where funding goes and hold up in essence, a mirror to the VCs to say you are deeply biased in where you give your money. And of course, to perhaps support female founders with their applications and their reviews in terms of rewording. I mean, we've seen for years the impact in recruitment of changing the job description and the wording that's used to make it subconsciously more friendly. But we have seen people talk about the opportunity to use AI to increase opportunities for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, to tackle some of the biases. Have you got any examples of where that might be applied and what the implications are of using AI in that way?
Yeah, so one of the things the first things I think that we can do is, and I in all of the organizations that I've worked with in technology and advise, I've tried very hard to get better diversity into the teams that work for me. And so one of the best things we can do is to hire the most senior person of the type of diversity or inequality that we're trying to address. So that's one thing I would say straight away. The other things that I think we can do are making sure we do understand the numbers, and that we do expose them as quickly as we can. And with the AI tools and techniques that we have, we can do this much more rapidly than we otherwise thought we could. We can now look at vast amounts of data that we couldn't possibly look at previously, and in literally seconds, extract the insights in that data and interrogate it. So I think those are all important things that we can and could be doing. And then other things I think about, you mentioned recruitment, and bias in job descriptions, for example. We can use AI tools to scan a job description, and I've used suppliers who've done this in my career, who will look at a job description and say, that's a very male-centric job description. Here are the reasons why. We've used the word aggressive, for example, when we could use another word that would be more aligned, if I could use that word, to particular types of talent that we're hoping to attract. So those are some examples, Resham, of things that I think we can and should be doing more of.
And those are great, and they're all really positive angles. But one of the concerns, particularly for people from a lower socioeconomic background, is that some of the jobs that they're in are perhaps the most likely to be able to be automated or replaced by AI. What does this mean for the people in those roles? Who do you think the automation or the AI is likely to replace first? And what could we and should we be doing about that?
Yeah, so I think a lot about the future of work, and the impact that AI will have. And I think there are 3 A's that I can reference. So the first A you've referred to is automation, and automation, taking our jobs. And that is a real risk. Mm-hmm. Jobs that have high data entry requirements that are very repeatable, those are the ones that are more susceptible to being fully automated, potentially. Then I think about the next A, which is about augmentation. So all of us are doing tasks within our jobs that weren't designed for humans, in my view, that are better designed, better managed by algorithms. And so,
like what?
So, for example, in preparing for this session, I did all my sort of research. It took me a bit longer than I'd expected because you asked me some tough questions. And I was then able, for example, to go into one of the Gen AI tools, and I'd done like too many pages and said, just summarize this. And in 10 seconds, I had a summary that I probably would have taken half an hour at least to have done, just as a basic example. A lot of data entry things that we might be doing, for example, we don't need to spend time. I think a lot about BI and dashboards, data dashboards. Some people might have to spend their entire day looking at graphs and clicking through. We don't need to do things like that anymore. We can use AI and data science techniques to find the nuggets of gold that sit in those data sets, and not have to spend the whole day doing all of the heavy work around that. So those are just some examples. So that's the augmentation point. So my first one was automation, second was augmentation, and the third is there will be additional jobs. There will be new jobs that we haven't thought about. One area that people may not be so familiar with are prompt engineers. So these are the people who go in and write the questions in a generative AI model like ChatGPT. And many people have done this, but it's now becoming a real skill. The way in which you write those prompts, as they're called, those questions, making sure, for example, that you ask for sources. So these models are prone to hallucination and to digital hallucinations and inventing stuff. And so one simple principle, for example, around prompt engineering is to always ask the Gen AI tool that you're using for the sources of information. And sometimes I will take the output from one Gen AI product and put it into another and say, can you test these and make sure that these are valid sources? So prompt engineers will be a big area. Another big area, in my view, will be the whole area of auditing these systems for the quality of data that we've talked about, for explainability, for model drift, for fairness, for bias, all of these things. So the world of audit. We also have in the area of sort of trust and ethics, there are 30 times more people working on building AI products than there are people working on building and looking at trust and ethics and fairness. That's not sustainable in my view, and so that's another rich area where I think we're going to see additional jobs. So things like AI fluency coaches will be important, the trust and ethics that I mentioned, and prompt engineering, a couple of examples of where we will see additional jobs.
So the jobs you've referenced as us potentially losing are the ones generally that people with lower education attainment levels will be in. And the jobs you've referenced, I mean, hugely skilled, prompt engineering, the auditing, the trust and the ethics, the AI fluency coaches. These are all jobs that will require extensive levels of education, kind of deep STEM knowledge and the ability to apply that. And these jobs in general are the ones that are harder to retrain in later in life. So what can we do and what should we be doing as a government and as an education system to make sure that these jobs are not just kind of reserved for the people who have the highest levels of education and the most socioeconomic background, but the ones that these are also open to people from a lower socioeconomic background too?
Yeah, so I think one thing is actually educating educators and parents and young people as well about the likely changes that we're going to see in the world of work, so that they have better visibility of where the opportunities are going to be and therefore can prepare themselves for that. Some of the roles that I mentioned, AI ethicists, for example, or prompt engineers, you don't necessarily need to have a technical background to do those things. My daughter has a degree in literature and philosophy, and I keep trying to convince her that that's a really good skill set for her to be able to ask the right questions, because it is a lot about how you frame a question, think about it, the answers that you get back. And so I wouldn't want to put people off who don't have technical backgrounds, because we need to have a range of capabilities and skills, from philosophers to ethicists to social sciences to technical teams as well. And then a whole space in the middle that I call sort of business translators, people who understand, a bit about the technology, but can then connect that to, business outcomes or social outcomes that we want to achieve. Mm-hmm. And then maybe the final point about, lower socioeconomic groups being more affected by some of the roles. Yes, I think that's a risk, but I hope through education, through early visibility of those risks, and by also helping those students by giving them, using AI, for example, to develop tailor-made learning and development plans for them, that disadvantage is narrowed going forward.
Well, good luck in convincing your daughter. I do think that's great because, as you say, we do have a lot of communities where that's not, I mean, obviously that would not be the case for you, but a lot of communities where parents don't push their children in that direction, and we need more people doing the ethics. So what role can individuals play in ensuring that AI is used for good if they don't want to go and do it as a full-time job?
So the role that they can play, I think, one is to shine a light on what they're seeing or what they're feeling, right? So, and voicing that, and then, allowing us to go interrogate the data to check whether those, what they're feeling, what they're sensing is actually happening. And so I think that's really, really important. I think secondly is to recognize that the world of work will be very different, and to start to invest in different skills, but also recognize that the skills that are required aren't just technical skills, to my earlier point. And then I think the third thing is be prepared to work alongside more technical profiles, because it's the combination of the domain expertise that some of these people that we're speaking about will have, and technology capability that will help to, one, shine a light, change it, and hopefully attack it much earlier on in the process, so its prevalence is reduced in the first instance.
That all makes a lot of sense. Hopefully the decision makers are listening to that, your advice there. Adrian, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I'd love to just hear your key takeaways. So what are your top level thoughts on AI and social mobility?
Well, firstly, it's a really good time to be having this conversation, because the advancements that we've seen in AI and the ability for it to either exacerbate or improve social mobility is now is the time to be having that conversation. And I'm very, very hopeful about the opportunities that exist to improve equality of outcomes in education, in healthcare, in policing, in the justice system, and in a host of other areas. And so that's my first point. The second thing I would say is it's not just about the technology, and I hope that's come through really clearly. Absolutely. That we have to have a number of participants, people who have the domain expertise, who understand the data, who understand the challenges, who are experiencing those challenges. For them to voice them is really, really important. And then I think the third thing I would say is collaborate with the AI community. We want to do, we want AI to be a force for good. I don't think there are many people who genuinely want, AI to be used in ways that would exacerbate existing social inequality. So I think those would be the three things I would say.
That's great. And I love the point about the lived experience, because that is so important to bring that experience and perspective. So I do want to ask you as the final question, where people can go to find out more, whether that's on AI, your work on diversity and equality, or in general about the crossover between the sectors. But I will give another plug to that select committee that you gave evidence at. It was to the Science and Tech Select Committee early last year, and it really covers, with Adrian and also several other experts, it covers all the questions you might have on AI. So do give it a listen. But what else can people do if they want to learn more?
Yeah, I'd say, follow the news. I get lots of news feeds into my inbox from a range of places. So, I get from Financial Times, from the BBC, from Google News, from TechCrunch. And so there's a wealth of information every day. There are tons and tons of articles. There's probably more written on AI than anything else at the moment. So stay abreast of it, I would say, is one thing. And then I would say also think about a number of institutions that are fixating around the connections between social mobility, fairness, and the use of AI and deep tech. And so the Alan Turing Institute, for example, is a great place to look for more information. The Ada Lovelace Institute, the Algorithmic Justice League that was started by Joy Boulami, who I referenced earlier on, and then the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, all really good places, in the UK that have a lot of experience, knowledge, insight, and calls to action that we should listen to.
Well, thank you, Adrian, so much for joining our podcast and for sharing your insights, wisdom and knowledge so generously. It's been a real privilege to have you. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us. Please do join us for further episodes of the Social Mobility Talks podcast, where we'll be discussing a huge range of social mobility topics. Make sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Thank you.